my friendly Evo! Welcome to Lovely Las Vegas for Cuss Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peters, and now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. We've got an excellent podcast for you. We're going to be joined in a few minutes by one of our good friends, Riley Frain, who does such an incredible job over at the Portal Report. He also does a great job over at Mid-Major Madness. We're going to be chatting with him about the fallout with St. Joe's, the fact that Steve Donahue is now going to be their head coach after Billy Lange decided that he was going to be leaving the team, and he didn't even become a staffer over with the New York Knicks. He's not going to be on the coaching staff. He's just going to be like in the front office. He might be like rebounding for Jalen Brunson. I'm not quite sure what's going to be happening, but he joins the New York Knicks. We're going to talk about how this all came about, how Steve Donahue is now going to be the man, and we're also going to be chatting about what the outlook might be for St. Joe's and the options for these guys on the roster, because they've got 30 days from the time that Steve Donahue was hired to be able to enter into the transfer portal. So we're going to be chatting about that and so much more. And if you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of two ways we offer those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at @GUnit_81. Keep in mind, they mean does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. While I did not get in any Twitter/X questions, everything is powered by EdgeBoost. EdgeBoost is making sure that bettors are able to have access to their funds whenever and wherever, and that 100% of gambling transactions do get approved when you go to edgeboost.bet. Make sure you utilize that promo code of Greg. GREG. That'll give you a dollar for dollar match on your first deposit up to $25. And with Riley, I know that he is locked in on a little bit of everything, and he has joined me quite a bit on this podcast because he is so good at being able to gauge the northeast part of the country, all these mid-major schools. You're able to follow him on the old Twitter/X and his first and last name, Riley Frain, and my last name is spelled Frain. And Riley, it's always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you.
Absolutely, Greg. Thank you so much for having me, man. Second time in the last week and a half now, maybe even just about a week. But yeah, always glad to be here. It's been a crazy few days.
Oh, it certainly has been, as we get it feels like, I would like to say 2 to 2.5 of these every offseason, where in September and October we have unexpected coaching changes, and we saw that with Billy Lange heading on over to the New York Knicks. He's not even going to be a part of the coaching staff. I don't know if he's going to be like the towel boy, if he's going to be rebounding for Jalen Brunson or what, but he heads on over to the New York Knicks. Steve Donahue gets a multi-year deal, and I mean, he was the coach over at Penn last season. He got canned for Fran McCaffrey, and well, he wasn't out of job too long because he'll be coaching night number 1 for St. Joe's. But just how do you look at this situation, and why do you think that this move happened as late as it did? Because it's just very perplexing to see a guy leave his job in the middle of September to join an NBA team and not even be a part of the coaching staff.
For everyone I've kind of talked to who covers the program, like myself, just, everyone who's media-wise that's sort of around the program, nobody necessarily inside the program, but I mean, up until really Tuesday, obviously it was announced Wednesday morning, so Tuesday night, the earliest, was really the first time anyone kind of heard anything about this. Apparently, Coach Donahue mentioned in a press conference this morning that Coach Lange had spoke to him over the weekend about something potentially arising, and it all kind of came to fruition Tuesday. And yeah, just back to what I had initially said, it wasn't really anything anyone around the program had seen coming. Now, how did it all kind of play out? I don't necessarily know. I think for me, the Billy Lange era, they've progressed every year. Statistically, record-wise, win-loss wise, this team's improved every year. But I think throughout the Billy Lange era, it's kind of been marked by teams underachieving despite maybe having a ton of talent. When you look back over the last 6 years of Lange's time on Hawk Hill, I mean, they've produced an NBA draft pick, a handful of guys who are getting some time in the G League. They've produced some guys who, are working their way up the coaching ladder in the assistant coaching world. Probably most importantly, they produced the program's all-time leading scorer in Eric Reynolds II. They sent Xavier Brown over to Oklahoma, who's probably going to be a starting guard in the SEC this year. So just over the past couple of years, it's the St. Joe's team that's had a ton of talent. I mean, you talked to some people around the A-10 last year, and there were a lot of people who felt maybe it was the most talented roster in the A-10, and really the best they could do was they finished 6th and fell short in the semifinals of the A-10 championship, and that was sort of like, it seemed maybe the best Lange could do. Like I said, a lot of people felt it was the most talented roster potentially in the conference last season, and to sort of finish in 6th and maybe not even get a shot at the championship in conference, again, it just felt like a little bit of underwhelming despite having so much talent on the team between Eric Reynolds and Rasheer Fleming and Xavier Brown and a handful of other guys. My best guesstimate, and again, I don't have it on good authority from anyone within the program, and certainly haven't spoke to Coach Lange on the matter, but my best guesstimate is they're coming into this year having lost their three leading contributors in those three guys that I just mentioned: Eric Reynolds, who's played some summer league with OKC, and Rasheer Fleming, who of course was selected with the first pick of the second round in the NBA draft, and then Xavier Brown, who's I mentioned is going to probably be a starting guard for Oklahoma this upcoming season. And so my best guess is, coming in this season, there were a lot of question marks around the St. Joe's team. They were able to return a couple of guys who, I think they were hoping could take a big step forward. They bought in a handful of guys who were, could be solid contributors. Deuce Jones was set to come over from, a local rival and a fellow A-10 conference program in LaSalle. And Jaden Glover, a former top 100 prospect, was transferring down from St. John's and, was expected to be pretty impactful. But there were still a lot of question marks surrounding this program coming into the season in terms of, who was going to fill what role, how guys were going to, improve and develop this season, who was going to sort of fill the gigantic gaping hole left by those three contributors who departed this offseason. I think Lange maybe took note of sort of coming into this season, the roster clearly was not as talented as it was last season's roster. Again, a lot of moving pieces, a lot of question marks kind of coming into the season. And, my best guess is maybe he used some of his former NBA connections to sort of, get a gig with the Knicks. He kind of mentioned that it's not necessarily on the coaching staff. From what I understand, it's sort of a role in player development and the front office, which was always Lange's specialty at St. Joe's, in my opinion, was his player development. Like I just mentioned, sort of all the growth we saw from some historic players on Hawk Hill, despite maybe underachieving in the wins and loss column. So long-winded point there to say, Greg, I think maybe he started to read the writing on the walls. This year's roster certainly wasn't shaping up to be as talented as last year's roster. There were a lot of question marks, a lot of moving pieces. I'm thinking he tried to get out of town a little bit early. And, maybe he did St. Joe's a little bit of a benefit too, as much as it feels like for St. Joe's fans, it feels like a little bit of slap in the face. Obviously he has struggled the past couple seasons and sort of the leadership at the university has, repaid that faith by giving him this additional season to return after, sort of falling short of expectations last year. And it feels like maybe he's kind of repaying that back by bringing in a bunch of transfers who now, as you mentioned, we'll touch on, have the opportunity to retransfer again. He's sort of built a lineup for this year that now might not be there for the upcoming season. And he's leaving less than 2 months ahead of the season, for an NBA job. So I think St. Joe's fans feel a little bit slighted, but, I think there's some positives and negatives to take from the situation. I think probably in the long run, it's going to be beneficial for a St. Joe's program that really just generally has sort of struggled throughout his time with the program. I'm excited to see what Steve Donahue can do. I'm sure we'll dive into it, but it's a multi-year deal they've established, between the two. So I'm interested to see if he can help sort of bring stability to, a Big Five program.
Yep, no question about it. And it's going to be so interesting to see what happens moving forward with that. As joining me on the show, we do have Riley Frain, who does great work over at Mid-Major Madness, along with the Portal Report, joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops. And now you mentioned it, over the next 30 days, and at the time of recording, about 4 or so weeks, it's going to be a case where St. Joe's can have some of these guys transfer out. But as we know, there's a lot of hoops to jump through because I was in college not too long ago. Typically, classes started on Labor Day, and that means that you're going to have a little bit of adventure trying to be getting all checked in and everything like that. If these guys do decide to transfer, it might be a case where they might not be eligible until the second semester. And how do you think this will be handled? Because they hire from within with Steve Donahue receiving a multi-year deal, and we've seen this a few times, and sometimes you'll get 1 or 2 guys that transfer, but I honestly think that St. Joe's should be able to maintain much of this roster and have Steve Donahue be able to just lead what we currently expect right now.
Yeah, I think in terms of the players, you have to feel a little tough for them. I think the timing of it is just so unfortunate because even if they were to enter the transfer portal, I mean, just what we know from talking.
And who has a roster spot open?
Exactly. Who's still recruiting out there? I mean, it's teams very low down the totem pole in terms of, college basketball and even maybe the 1 or 2 high major teams that have a spot left, whether it be they just decided not to fill it or, whatever the situation might be. Their rotations for the most part are pretty set and they're not necessarily looking to add in new guys who are going to be super impactful. They've been practicing as a team for the past couple months over the summer here. Obviously, they're all getting back together on campus now and starting to fire things up again. And, so I think it would be a little strange to try to add a new, player into the mix now. Now, of course, there's other options with red shirts and things like that. And, you sort of mentioned up the academic side of it. I'm not necessarily sure how things would play out, on that side of it. But yeah, so anyone actively on the St. Joe's roster will have a 30-day window here to decide whether they want to enter the transfer portal or not. But I think the big thing you mentioned there is, they hired a guy from within, a local Philly guy too, who has a lot of experience within the city, which, no doubt I think is invaluable sort of in a period of transition here for a school like St. Joe's. I know he's only been with the team since May, so really, only a couple months here, not that long. But, I think sort of the way it played out here, I feel like St. Joe's was a little bit blindsided by the move, obviously from sort of how Donahue explained it in the press conference. He was really the first one to know as early as potentially something was happening over the weekend. How it played out, Donahue comes in over the weekend. It seems like no one really knew much about it until Sunday at the earliest. Lange kind of breaks it down Wednesday morning, and it seemed like maybe Tuesday night he had expressed to Donahue that it was confirmed he was going to the Knicks. I think the interesting about it is, St. Joe's, the way they play, the way the situation plays out. I don't know if Donahue's the best option for the role. I think, we'll get into that in a little bit of his resume in a little bit, I'm sure. But, I think he was the safest option because obviously it's tough to do a national coaching search right now. But I think instead of maybe slapping the interim tag on him and saying, kicking the can down the road a little bit and saying, hey, we'll look for someone, more toward the end of next year, heading into the off season, you're saying, hey, we'll offer, Donahue a multi-year deal. And, I think that year multi is a little bit, I don't think it's a 3 or 4 or 5 year deal. I think maybe this deal is at most 2 or 3. And sort of the goal being that Donahue's a local guy. He can provide some stability to the program. And, if we're saying, hey, this is going to be the guy for the next 2 years, I think that's sort of a pitch to players for, hey, there's not a lot going on in the transfer portal, right now. We have your head coach for the next 2, potentially 3 years, however long this multi-year deal is. In terms of if you're a player, it's sort of, I think that the way St. Joe's sort of lined it up, giving Donahue the multi-year deal, it provides a layer of safety for the players. I think it makes it easier to retain some of them just based on their relationship. They know he's going to be around, probably leading the program for the next 2 years. I think that's going to help them to retain some of the talent on the team. I'd imagine, we're going to see a couple guys enter the transfer portal here and there just by the nature of the situations. And, I don't necessarily know where they're going to end up. But, I think the positive thing at the moment is I don't have it on good authority from anyone who's returning, who's not. We're seeing a handful of the players currently on the roster, sort of promote Steve Donahue's stuff on social media and whatnot and his hiring for the team. So, it seems like a lot of the guys who are expected to be consistent contributors. I know Jaden Glover and Deuce Jones both reposted something, the 2 big transfers this offseason. There's a lot of question marks certainly up in the air. I do think there are probably going to be some guys who enter the transfer portal, but it seems like everyone's sort of willing to hear out Steve Donahue and, what his plan is for the next year.
I think that is going to be so interesting because for Steve Donahue, he really hasn't coached a lot with schools that deal with NIL. And I think that this is a good stopping point for part 1 to dive into part 2. What can we expect from Steve Donahue in terms of how he's going to be able to do at St. Joe's? What is the outlook going to be for this year and perhaps next year for St. Joe's as well in an Atlantic 10 where it feels like there's going to be a big giant middle once again this year. So we need to get the outlook for St. Joe's for this season and so much more with Riley on the flip side right here on Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Good lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. We're rejoined by Riley Frain, who does such great work over at Mid-Major Madness and the Portal Report, based out there in the northeast part of the country. Did an incredible job taking a look at the St. Joe's story over the last few days with Billy Lange stepping down and now Steve Donahue being the coach. And you're able to follow him on the old Twitter/X at his first and last name, Riley Frain, Frain on that last name is how you spell it. And Riley, we left off talking about it just before the break, the fact that Steve Donahue, he's a very experienced coach. He was coaching out there in the Ivy League and for a few years at Boston College, but hasn't really had to deal with NIL too much with his previous stops. His tenure at Boston College, he got a 21 season to begin with. I believe that he was replacing Al Skinner, and the cupboard was pretty full there, and then things went downward after that. And then at Penn, felt like he really had a nice team about 7 to 8 years ago, and then afterwards it went downhill to the point where he got replaced by Frain here in the offseason. So I think that's interesting because I think his X's and O's might be a little bit better than Billy Lange, but in terms of roster construction for next offseason and trying to retain these guys, I think that that's really the big question mark because coaching out there in the Ivy League is just so much different than pretty much anywhere else in college basketball.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up that dynamic between Lange and Donahue, and I think I sort of mentioned it before, but the biggest thing about Lange during his tenure with St. Joe's was his player development, his recruiting. I mean, obviously he secured some of the highest ranked prospects in St. Joe's history, but obviously he was able to develop some guys too. I mean, Rasheer Fleming was, I believe, non-ranked coming out of high school and sat on the bench, for a really good Camden high school team that had multiple top 100 prospects on the roster. He flew completely under the radar, and, the staff, and obviously with Lange at the helm, they're able to develop him into an NBA guy. When I look at the Steve Donahue hire back in May, I think the real reason for me was that they added him on as associate head coach was, to your point, Greg, because he's much more of an X's and O's guy, than Billy was. So I think they were hoping, he could bring a little bit of what St. Joe's had been missing to the coaching staff for the past couple of years. Obviously, it didn't play out like that, and now Steve Donahue is taking over at the helm of the St. Joe's program. But yes, to your point, Greg, like I 100% agree. He's coming from an Ivy League where he never really had to deal with the transfer portal outside of probably his last season coming in the Ivy League with Penn, where they recruited, I believe, 2 or 3 transfer portal guys. Ethan Roberts coming over from Drake, where he was a redshirt the year prior, sort of being the primary example, and turned him into a really good contributor. But, they only finished with 8 wins his final season in the Ivy League. And really, I believe 3 of his last 4 years in the Ivy League were sort of, the transfer portal and NIL started to play a big role. The Quakers finished with losing seasons. 100%, Greg. To your point, I think he's, a lot to be liked about in terms of the X's and O's. Like he's, known for turning around some programs that have been struggling. And I think he's going to be great in terms of on the court coaching. But, if this deal sort of extends 3-4 years, down the line, even whatever sort of St. Joe's has in mind with the situation, I'm interested to see how the recruiting plays out, how he sort of navigates the transfer portal and NIL. I think of the A10, and I think a lot of the rankings would suggest it's probably one of the upper echelon of those mid-major conferences, sort of like, Mountain West, WCC area, those conferences, you think of when you think of potential multi-bid leagues for the NCAA tournament. I think of St. Joe's within the A10 and sort of the budget and the resources they have. And, I imagine it's top half of the conference, if not, top 6, top 5 of the conference. They just built a brand new practice facility. So there's a lot going on to navigate there. Donahue is going to have a lot of opportunities to sort of continue on Lange's legacy of recruiting and working in the transfer portal and developing players. To that point, he's going to have to rely on a lot of his assistant coaches for that because, again, he doesn't have a ton of experience coming from the Ivy League. It's new to him. He's going to do a lot of learning. The good thing about that is that, they retain a lot of the staff that was there with Lange. They're still running things under the same general manager and Rob Sullivan, who's really a lifetime Hawk and was on that Jameer Nelson, Delonte West team in 2003-04. They're keeping around a lot of these same assistant coaches. Dwayne Jones, who played for the Hawks as well and is, now an assistant coach with the program. Bino Rinson pretty recently joined the staff, but works as an assistant coach and a recruiting coordinator, has a ton of high major experience. And I've talked to some people how I imagine he'll be a guy that, Donahue will kind of have to lean on because of his high major experience and because, of his experience in recruiting. So the nice thing about it is, yes, Donahue is probably a guy who's very much known for his X's and O's, and his experience in recruiting is definitely lacking. If this is the guy St. Joe's is going to choose to kind of build around over the next couple of years, especially if he has, is able to really have a slam dunk home run like first year here with the program, I think he's going to have to rely on a lot of his assistants, a lot of the guys around him who have had some success in developing and recruiting players with Lange over the past couple of years.
Yep, no question about it. I do think that it's going to be very, very fascinating to see how things are going to be going for St. Joe's, because I just take a look at the landscape of the Atlantic 10, and it feels like there's probably going to be a big giant middle once again, with St. Joe's, in my opinion, being one of those teams. You've got Duquesne, who I think is going to be rock solid in season number 2 under their current coaching regime, and Duquesne might be the only team that has more experience returning than St. Joe's. I know that George Washington is up there as well. They added a lot of transfers. I think that they're going to be rock solid as well, but I mean, they're going to be right there. Loyal Chicago, St. Louis are teams that I think are going to be rock solid this season. St. Bonaventure doesn't return a ton, but I mean, when you add in there a guy in Woj who is going to do great things there, that's interesting. Yeah. Fordham, I like the hire of Mike Magpio. I think that might be a little bit of a rough year for Rhode Island as they return quite literally nothing from last year. But that said, I take a look at this conference and it's a big giant middle in my opinion. And for St. Joe's, they have the guys in my opinion to really be able to climb and be a rock solid team. But I think that now they're the most mysterious team in the conference where they could have a very, very high ceiling, but they might have a very low floor as well.
Yeah. The first thing is, and that we kind of touched on already, is I think we need to wait and see how the next 30 days play out, who enters the transfer portal, of course. But, obviously, as we mentioned, it's so late in the offseason, I don't think it would be crazy to see all these guys stay and fight for another year, down the line to transfer out if, they're not happy with the situation come year's end. I think just by nature of how empty the transfer portal is right now in terms of scholarship opportunities, if St. Joe's keeps 90% of this roster, even 100%, I don't think that would be outrageous. So, yeah, I mean, looking ahead a little bit, I think it's interesting because they are returning a handful of guys. Derek Simpson, who was one of their lead guards last year and not typically a scorer, probably more of a playmaker, but a guy they're going to lean on to probably take a big step forward here. I think of Justice Ajabor, sort of the big man in the middle and an incredible defensive player, but, another guy they're going to need to take a big step here and be a solid offensive contributor, a consistent offensive contributor as well. Another guy I'd like to touch on as well, Anthony Finkley, who's returning, and another guy who they're going to need to take another step forward to be competitive here, but who was able to show it in flashes last year, and he ends up averaging, about 7 points per game and almost 4 rebounds. So another guy who they feel could be a solid contributor. And then they added a couple guys from the transfer portal who have some big upside, really. Deuce Jones coming over from LaSalle, A10 Heisman Rookie of the Year last year. He's the guy who's kind of proven in the conference, so they're going to rely on him. I imagine he's a day one starter on this team coming in, assuming he stays with the program through this transfer portal window over the next 30 days. He's the guy they're going to rely on just, by nature of his success in the conference last year. Now, he can be a little bit of a wild card. He can be a little bit frantic and all over the place sometimes. And obviously that's, sometimes how freshmen are. He's going to grow. He's going to learn a little bit. I think having a senior to lean on in the backcourt, like Derek Simpson, who's more of a playmaker, is going to be really beneficial for Deuce Jones. And then I think really the other big guy, the other big question mark for me, is Jaden Glover, who I mentioned earlier, coming down from St. John's, a former top 100 prospect. So the pedigree is there. Obviously, the talent is there. He didn't play a lot for St. John's in year one. So it's a matter of how impactful can he be, as a guy who doesn't have a ton of experience at this level. Obviously the A-10 is certainly not, the Big East where St. John's was dominating, playing at a very high level last year. So, minutes were just tough to come by, and obviously in that rotation, and you expect he's going to get a lot more playing time, for this St. Joe's program, assuming he stays. It's going to be about how impactful can he be as a guy who isn't super experienced at this level. The talent's there. People are very high on him, and how impactful he can be. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Hawk Hill Hardwood, who covers the program very closely, but he's raved about what he's seen from Jaden in practice and things like that. Going back to sort of your initial question, obviously the hypothetical being if this entire roster were to stay, it's a lot of question marks because there's returning pieces, there's a lot of returning minutes, but it's guys that they need to take a step up. I think the guys coming in from the transfer portal, outside of maybe a Deuce Jones, who, I think you kind of know what you expect, but I'm talking about like Jaden Glover. I just talked about Jaden Smith, who's coming over from Fordham. Amadou, who was highly regarded, started his career at Marquette and now transfers over. It's a lot of guys who are a little bit question marks, and St. Joe's is going to have to rely on to be more impactful than they were, at previous stops if they want to be, sort of in that upper tier of that mid-table pack that we kind of talked about a little bit there.
Yep, and it is going to be so interesting to see what we get in the Atlantic 10 this season, because I think it might be one of the most fun conferences out there. They always love to pulverize each other within the conference, oftentimes robbing themselves of an at-large bid or two, but that's what makes it so much fun during the season. And yeah, I know you, Riley, do a tremendous job of covering the Atlantic 10 and a little bit of everything over there at the Portal Report, along with Mid-Major Madness. So let the good people at home know what's all on tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Yeah, absolutely, Greg. Of course. First off, thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to be here with you talking some college hoops, but, of course, my alma mater, St. Joe's here, most importantly. As Greg mentioned there, I do tons of college basketball related coverage for Mid-Major Madness and the Portal Report. So a lot of my coverage is Northeast mid-major focused, transfer portal focused. I do a ton of things like the A-10, the CAA, the MAC, the Northeast Conference, a whole bunch of things like that. So, of course, if you're interested in any of that, you can come check me out on Twitter. It's just at Riley Frain, RILEYFRAIN. We're revving up with the season, less than 2 months away here. Lots of preseason coverage coming your way. Of course, I had a breaking, article on sort of the St. Joe's situation. I'm going to try to get down there for media next week, so I'll probably have a story to follow on that and sort of how it's playing out at St. Joe's, over the last week or so, and hopefully we'll have an update on players. So yeah, lots more to come in the next couple weeks. And Greg, thank you, of course, for having me. I really appreciate it.
It is always great to be able to get Riley aboard. Such a wealth of knowledge when it comes to this great sport of college basketball. Doing a tremendous job looking at the mid-majors out there in the Northeast part of the country, and every single time he joins me, lends such great insights. So a big thanks to Riley for joining me on Cuz Soups, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. And if you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Cuz Soups, you're able to subscribe wherever your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of two ways we all fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, LRCM, name does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. I am with you guys every single day on this podcast, regular season and off season, WCC Conference Preview Edition. That most likely is going to be coming your way tomorrow, so be on the lookout for that, and I'll be back with you guys once again tomorrow. Thank you.